once you start having conversations with your donors, you start hearing that why they give is not because of sponsorship benefits. Why they give is because of a personal connection to the mission, right? So that's one first tip, is really start listening to the whys behind people give. And that helps you move in the right direction. And same thing with your staff, right? Asking them why here versus anywhere else, really, any other cause, any other organization working in a similar sector, like why this one? And pulling those whys will really help you set the direction of where your fundraising needs to go.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Fundraising in the nonprofit sector has long relied on transactional models that center donors rather than the communities organizations serve. But a growing movement, Community-Centric Fundraising, is reimagining this approach by placing relationships, equity, and community at the heart of fundraising. In this episode, we welcome Maria Rio, a fundraiser with 10 years experience, who also brings lived experience as a service user. Over the last couple of years, Maria has been applying community-centric fundraising principles to create more authentic, equitable, and mission-aligned fundraising practices. Maria is also the host of the Small Nonprofit podcast, where she discusses issues related to our sector and provides practical advice to fundraising professionals and leaders. Welcome, Maria. Thanks for joining us on Let's Imagine here today.
So happy to be here. Thank you, Bruce.
So before we dive in, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey into the world of fundraising and how your personal and professional experiences have shaped the way you approach your work today?
Thank you so much, Bruce. So yes, my name is Maria. My pronouns are she and her. I came to Canada as a refugee when I was 9 years old, and I used a lot of charitable services growing up. One of them being me, my family, my mom, my sibling. We stayed at a World Vision refugee shelter in downtown Toronto. So when I was old enough to start fundraising as a, late teen, 19, I started fundraising in a face-to-face company called Public Outreach. So Public Outreach, what they do is they stop you on the street and they get you to do a monthly donation. So I worked there for 4.5 years, representing a lot of different organizations, both at a local scale and a national scale, getting people to do small monthly gifts. From there, I moved into nonprofit proper. So all of these experiences that I had gone through with the charitable services, I think really informed my approach as a fundraiser once I moved into nonprofit proper. And I started leading teams. So I became a director of development and communications at a few different spots. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of issues in the nonprofit proper side of the equation that I would love to be solved. And some of them started to kind of hit me harder and harder as a director of development and communications, because I would have my ED say, hey, can you put in an accent for that video? Or a major donor compliment my English. So little things that felt like they were kind of grinding me down. And then bigger things, being put under a lot of pressure to throw a gala at a place where it didn't feel mission aligned, right? So do we really want to be throwing a gala that's $300 to $500 a ticket for a cause that's about food insecurity? When I myself have experienced food insecurity, I feel like, this ticket is too expensive. That's months of groceries, right? Multiple months of groceries. So I felt like a lot of my lived experience was brought forward into my professional experience. And then when I felt like there was a lot of resistance to change internally, or a real disconnect from the mission, from the people in charge, I think that's when I decided to move into consulting myself. So I started my company 2.5 years ago, Further Together. And what we do is we focus on helping EDs who are radical, who want to do things differently, who want to innovate and want to work in tandem with community values and priorities, raise more money without the stress. So I've been doing that for almost 3 years now. It's been an exciting journey, but that's kind of how my professional and personal stories collide.
That's great. Thank you. And it would inform, I would think, your work so much to have such grounded, lived experience. So as you are talking with prospective donors or partners or supporters, having that firsthand knowledge about how the other side of the equation works would be really beneficial. So we're going to talk a little bit about fundraising today, obviously. And how would you explain the philosophy behind community-centric fundraising to someone who's new to this concept? It's a term that might not be widely known. So maybe you could help us just understand a bit more about the philosophy behind it.
Absolutely. So right now we have two fundraising models that we know exist, right? We have donor-centric fundraising, which has been the status quo for many, many years. And now we have community-centric fundraising, which started in around 2017 by Boule and a bunch of other racialized fundraisers out of Seattle. So now we have two different models. The biggest difference between them is who is centered as a decision maker and, I guess, put on the pedestal. With donor-centric fundraising, we have the donor, of course, right? We say like, you did this, we couldn't do it without you. We really do a lot of like mostly platitudes because there's not a lot of deep relationship building when you kind of just, you did this and don't explain the systemic issues behind it. But it's feel-good charity. So, for example, we wouldn't talk about food as a political issue. It's a nonpartisan issue. Everyone can get behind it, right? So that's very donor-centric. We're really centering comfort. With community-centric fundraising, we want to peel back the layers so that donors actually understand what's going on in the world, even if they don't have the lived experience to inform their own philanthropy, right? So it's about putting the community on that pedestal and like really uplifting their voices and doing things in a way that is most aligned with their needs, their dignity, their autonomy, and not about, the organization, like the ego of the ED or a board member or me as a fundraiser, like my accolades of, I'm such a good fundraiser. Look how much money I brought in. Because if it doesn't translate into like tangible, hopefully systemic differences for our community, then what are we really doing? We're just bringing money in and spending it. And again and again and again, having this kind of like piecemeal approach to address the effects of systemic issues, but never actually addressing the systemic issues that cause those effects.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's interesting. I've heard over the years that, one of the challenges in our sector as it relates to fund development and the solicitation of dollars is this notion of power and where that power resides. And it strikes me that community-centric fundraising redefines how we think about donor relationships. So from your perspective, how does community-centric fundraising shift traditional notions of donor stewardship to promote equity and shared power?
I think community-centric fundraising as a lens for how we do the work, right? So it's just like an additional filter for the things that we would or wouldn't do. So how it changes relationship building with a donor, like I have in the past talked to donors about the source of their wealth, tax avoidance, wealth hoarding. What are the causes of these issues, right? So back to the food example, if someone's food insecure, why is that? Right? So really asking them to think about why is this person facing this situation and what are the barriers that they're facing now to get out of it themselves. So like really removing ourselves, including the fundraiser and the nonprofit, from the savior situation and really pointing out the barriers that people face. So it's how we talk about our service users, how we position our organization and what we do, and how we talk about the donor that's really, really important here because these things will help the donor understand we need them to be more than just a check writer. We need them to be a partner in the work. We need their solidarity. We need their vote, right? We need them to do their taxes in a way that actually does promote equity. So really pulling the curtain behind what nonprofit work is. All the stuff that we know internally that usually we would never talk to the donor about, like deficits or this program didn't work, but that we would want them to know about if we want them to be partners in the work, right? So really treating them as a co-conspirator rather than an ATM.
Yeah, so you started to maybe to cross this bridge from theory and philosophy to practice. And so as we think about this, what thoughts can you offer around practical steps that organizations can take to move from sort of a transactional or traditional fundraising approaches to building non-transactional, more trust-based relationships with donors and community members, keeping in mind that some of the comments that you just made, they may be difficult types of conversations to have with donors because they challenge the very nature of wealth creation.
I think not every single donor is ready for this conversation. So I'll just, couch that there, because first you want to see what their understanding of social justice is, right? They have a very different lived experience. You don't want to just push them into the deep end. That's not fair to them, and that's not bringing them along, right? So how I do this personally is I say, like, my name is Maria Rio, my pronouns are she and her, and then see how do they react about the pronouns comment, right? Like, do they understand something that's kind of that basic in our, social justice world? If they do, like, maybe I'll try another word like white supremacy and see if they have a reaction to that. If they don't, then I can continue to like have the conversation without feeling like they're going to be confused or hurt or anything like that. So that's the main pathway to having those conversations. Another one is also like tying it back to the cause. So if you serve people who don't have access to a certain medication for some reason, why is that? Right? So it's like, oh, because of policy decisions made at this government. Why do they make those decisions? Oh, because of this. And also explain to the donor all the stuff around the nonprofit industrial complex of like, not only are you part of the issue because you're giving me money to subsidize what the government should be doing, I'm also part of the issue because I'm asking you for money to subsidize what the government should be doing, right? So we have to take a double-pronged approach where we want to focus on the short-term supports that we can provide people. We can't just, stop and close shop and just leave, right? We have to do the short-term and the long-term public policy priorities, right? So talking to donors about what those public policy priorities are and how you determine them, I think is really, really helpful for them to understand how they can better be partners and co-conspirators than just, giving you a check or showing up to an event and doing something that's very transactional, right? So basically asking people to show up differently and giving them the tools to do so.
It strikes me that in listening to your comments, that the idea of active, intentional listening is really critical in this process to understand the starting point of the donor prospect that you might be talking with. Because to your earlier point, they may be further down a continuum of openness around having more robust conversations around topics where there may be some who are very much at a starting place, and you've got to listen and understand those cues to be able to then craft the message in a way that resonates with the individual.
I would love to add that usually donors are much more ahead in their thinking than board members. Like, donors since the murder of George Floyd have really deeply been engaging with the source of their wealth, with power, with race. Like, they've been thinking about this for years now. Usually it's not the donors where I get pushback or any kind of like confusion, because even donors, when I mention community-centric fundraising, they'll go out there and do research. They'll actually listen to the podcast that I'm sending them, and then they'll come back and ask me more questions. So it's been pretty easy going with donors, which I think we let a lot of our fears and assumptions like lead our fundraising strategy, which it doesn't necessarily have to.
Now, that's so interesting in terms of not self-editing from having those conversations, but rather taking our cues from the donors. So I know you got a real interest in supporting and helping smaller organizations. And as you're well aware, and the folks who are listening to the podcast, that many organizations, most nonprofits, operate with limited resources. So how can smaller organizations apply community-centric fundraising principles without overwhelming their teams? How do they get started on this?
Unfortunately, all fundraising teams are overwhelmed. So it's hard to say like this will not overwhelm you, because I think any kind of fundraising can be quite difficult. That being said, I think small organizations are better positioned than large ones to adopt the principles of community-centric fundraising. And here's why. First, you're closer to the community, so you understand more deeply what the community is looking for. You can put that into actionable things and bring that to your donors, right? Second, you're probably not having the same gift sizes that might make it very difficult for a larger organization to pivot or to reject funding, right? So if you have a $5 million organization and $2 million of that is coming from Amazon or another like murky, dirty money, dirty donor dilemma stuff, then you're in a tougher situation than if you are raising $2 million and you need to consider like, okay, do we do the Scala or not? right? Like you are growing your fundraising and you can do it in a way that is aligned with your values versus like, oh, I have a $200 million organization. I had to take away 30 million or something like that. So I think smaller organizations are much better positioned. And also I feel like organizations in general, no matter the size, are able to take on some of these things without expending additional energy. So an example of that would be dignified storytelling, right? So connecting with people and really giving them autonomy over how their story is told, it's not that much harder than collecting a story and telling it for them, right? Like asking them like, hey, this is going to be public. Like, are you okay with that? Can we use a pseudonym or do you want to use your real name? Is there a picture that you want to include or do you want me to pick one, right? Like just that consent being baked into the process is something that doesn't require additional funds, but you can start tackling right away. And there's a lot of things like that in community-centric fundraising that like maybe we don't have the expertise around just yet because it is a new fundraising model, but you are able to implement for free.
Now, you've introduced the idea of storytelling, and I think the conversation thus far has really illuminated this idea that the messages that will be conveyed in this type of approach might be different. And I think lots of organizations, because of the demand on resources, often repeat what they've done in the past, especially if there's been a measure of success with it. You know, why move away from something that works? So as you're thinking about this shift to a community-centric fundraising approach, you know, how can organizations shift their narratives to center on the community rather than the donor? It may seem small, but it sounds like really important. So how do you have any suggestions for organizations on how they do that?
I think for a lot of our leaders, like we have a lot on our plate. So if you're finding it a little bit difficult to switch from donor-centric to community-centric, don't worry. I definitely 100% understand because we're risk-averse creatures, humans. Like it's one of our cognitive biases being risk-averse. So if you have something new, if you don't fully understand it, you might automatically reject it, even if it's better for you. So like understanding that about yourself and also how burnt out you probably are, those two things play a big role in how we keep returning to the things that we know work. So the first thing is try to get some rest. The second is make decisions based on data, right? Make decisions based on what you're hearing from your community and from your staff, right? Not on what has worked before, because a lot of organizations are going to be left in the dust doing what has worked before, because a lot of donors have moved forward from that very, very much so, right? So really thinking about how we position ourselves, how we tell those stories, how we present the organization will become very, very important, especially as Canada Helps released a study earlier this year on donors that feel connected to their community, give more and give for longer periods of time. So we know that they're not looking for something transactional. It just makes sense to move in this direction. And also, if you have been paying attention to the broader strokes of fundraising, you can see some of these things already as being tried and true. So back to World Vision, you know, a cause dear to my heart. You remember those ads with kids covered in flies, extended stomachs, all that stuff. That was donor-centric gold, right? But now we're moving towards things like Plan Canada, where they have the Because I'm a Girl campaign that's all about empowerment and hope rather than guilt. That's more community-centric. And you can start seeing kind of the narrative shift, even with MSF as well. They had an anti-Black racism call out a few years ago, and they did a campaign of like, oh, here's how the image was cropped before to show this baby as kind of helpless in the arms of our white staffer. But if you zoom out, the mom was there the whole time. So there's a lot of things that we can start to see out in the world that are working for these organizations to have lots and lots and lots of money that we can only dream about in our smaller organizations, but that you can actually start seeing and applying. Also, try it out. You never know. Like, you know your community best, so you never know who's going to react really well to it. I've seen some organizations like go from, instead of having a gala, we're going to go camping because our organization does camping for kids with cancer, for example, right? And I think that's something that donors, like, because it builds that community and because it feels so connected to the cause, they respond so well to it.
You know, it's interesting as we're having this conversation, so much of this is around the intentionality of messaging. And I think it applies not just to fundraising, but it can be broader. And when we think about organizations, often inside their very operations, fundraising and advocacy are quite often siloed. So, from your perspective, how can organizations better integrate fundraising with community advocacy and policy work?
Usually there's a lot of distrust from the programs team and the advocacy side because they feel fundraising can be quite exploitative. They've seen their community members be asked for information and be put in front of the media and maybe be left out to dry, right? That's one big thing that fundraisers need to overcome when it comes to building those relationships. It's building that trust. So for me, the way that I like to do it is say, hey, I have lived experience. Here are the questions that I'm going to be asking the community members, right? So you know that these are comfortable questions for them, that they're not going to be asked, like, what was it like living in a shelter? Obviously bad, like they're going to be asked, like, what brought you to our organization? More open-ended. They are able to share as much or as little as they would like. So really building that trust and that like shared values piece is really important. So your fundraising and advocacy work in tandem, right? I also care about policy outcomes. I'm not just here to fundraise as much as possible, which is, a very donor-centric fundraising model. Just raise as much as possible, however you can, and the end justifies the means, basically. With community-centric fundraising, is let's do this in a way that feels right, because we're also very deeply invested in this as people, as staff people, right? So it has to feel right for our team. And that way it will speak better to everyone else that we're talking to, like our donors, our service users, our policymakers, right? They'll understand better where we're coming from.
So, as we think about this philosophy or approach, whether it's exclusively for fundraising or it is broader within the organization to encapsulate storytelling, narrative conversations, public policy advocacy, it may be different than what the organization is doing right now. And what we know is that change is hard, especially when it means rethinking longstanding practices. So, having been someone who's been an advocate for this approach, what do you see are some of the common challenges or resistance points that organizations face when transitioning to a community-centric fundraising approach? And have you seen any opportunities or areas on how they can be addressed?
I think one of the biggest barriers is actually fear. People think, oh, we're not going to raise as much money, or, we're going to lose our donors, or what if we do lose all of our sponsorships and they don't transfer over to like philanthropy, right? And I think all of those fears are very valid. That being said, they're not always grounded in actuality, right? So like once you start having conversations with your donors, you start hearing that why they give is not because of sponsorship benefits. Why they give is because of a personal connection to the mission, right? So that's one first tip, is really start listening to the whys behind people give. And that helps you move in the right direction. And same thing with your staff, right? Asking them why here versus anywhere else, really, any other cause, any other organization working in a similar sector, like why this one? And pulling those whys will really help you set the direction of where your fundraising needs to go.
So beyond the tactics, this is a movement about transforming systems. So how does community-centric fundraising contribute to dismantling inequities within the nonprofit sector's fundraising culture?
There's a lot of different ways, but it's kind of specific to each organization. So one way might be, hey, you have a racialized fundraiser, maybe give them a little bit extra money so they can do more professional development that maybe they didn't have access to before. Another one would be having those difficult conversations with donors. So it kind of works piecemeal as well. And also one criticism that I have of community-centric fundraising is that it still stays in the nonprofit model, right? So it tries to dismantle the system issues from inside the system, which is hard, right? Like it's the same issue that we have with capitalism, right? Like it makes it a little bit harder. But I think dismantling the inequity has been about like saying the quiet part loud. So really making sure that you're calling it out is one part, and calling people in. Trying to adapt these principles throughout your whole organization. So not just in fundraising, in your hiring, in your board recruitment, and how you engage with communities. So it's not just give me your data and buy, like you're actually building relationships with those communities. And also in how we think about donor positioning and DAFs, I think is a big, big part of that as well. So how do we treat our most important people, so our volunteers and our staff, And how do we position the organization and the donors and the service users in that ecosystem?
So as we wrap up the podcast, I'm going to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests. What gives you hope, and in this case, about the future of fundraising in the nonprofit sector?
With my podcast, The Small Nonprofit, I'm able to have a lot of conversations around how people are innovating. And I see that necessity really is the mother of invention. People are coming up with really amazing ways to partner up with each other. So, for example, Ross Sabras from C3 Collective, she is working in a space where organizations are actually coming together to share their donor list and throw a fundraising event together, right? Some other organizations are thinking about social enterprise and like how they can actually fund the change they want to see in the world themselves, right? Without having to rely on, a government or having to worry about biting the hand that feeds you, right? So I feel like the way people are innovating and how they're thinking differently and how they're not waiting for good things to happen, right? Because a lot of bad things keep happening, right? They're actually putting the power in their hands and in the hands of their community has been really inspiring and really lovely to be able to talk about.
Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. And I hope that people can reach out and connect with you to learn more about community-centric fundraising. So Maria, again, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.